Hello, everyone. This is part two of the history lesson from my oldest grandson and his name is Isaac, and it's on the Athenians. And so we'll continue that now.
So just to recap from all the talking I did first part, so it's simple for people. I talked about how the Athenians got a democracy, and how that democracy was threatened by a disgruntled aristocrat who went to a foreign power to get himself reinstated. And what had happened was this foreign power, Sparta, led by King Cleomenes, who was really mad at his initial humiliation by the Athenians, came back with an overwhelming force. It looked like Athens was going to get destroyed, but then at the last minute, because Cleomenes carried his revenge too far, his allies said, we don't really want to do this. Because the allies didn't have a grudge against Athens. We don't care what Athens wants to do. We just, why should we have to fight them? And especially to install a tyrant. Because that's what Cleomenes wanted. He said, I'm going to put a tyrant over Athens. And his allies said, we all hate tyrants. Sparta has historically taken a stance against tyrants. What are you doing?
Yeah.
And so they all left, and then Athens was saved. And so Athenian democracy was saved. So is there any questions you had about the first part?
Well, I wanted to remind everybody how many years before Christ that this happened.
Yes, so this is all happening 500 to 600 years before Christ. So this is around the time when you have the Babylonian captivity, and a little bit before the time of Nehemiah. So that's when that's taking place.
Okay.
And so once Athens gets democracy, and I explained a little bit how that worked, it's the next big event in Greek history happens at around 500 to 480 BC. Mm-hmm. So I know the exact dates on that because this is the one I've read up a little bit more on. But anyway, so that is the Persian Wars. And we have King Darius, and I'm pretty sure this is the Darius mentioned in the book of Daniel. And what happened was there were, where Greece is, right? Italy's over here, here's Greece, and then here's Turkey, which is Asia Minor. Paul did his missionary journeys mostly in Asia Minor and also went into Greece and visited Athens, right? Much later, 500 years later. But here you have Asia Minor. And Asia Minor is under the control of the Persian Empire. And we know about the Persian Empire from the Bible, in the book of Daniel specifically. But you have the Persian Empire here, you have Greece here, and you have Rome just getting born over in Italy. But the Greeks, from, time immemorial, they didn't stay still in Greece. They loved to sail. They were somehow, I believe, and this is stuff I haven't researched very much, but I believe the Greeks and the Phoenicians were interrelated to some extent. But the Greeks, they sailed all around the Mediterranean. And I believe the Greek alphabet comes from the Phoenician alphabet. Is what I think I read. I don't. You'll have to. Everyone will have to fact check me on that. But the Greeks sailed all around the Mediterranean and established colonies everywhere, including in Persian-controlled Asia Minor. So one of these guys in the Persian Empire was kind of down on his luck. He had led an expedition for the king of Persia to try to conquer some island, and he failed. And so, he was down on his luck. He was kind of in trouble, and he thought, well, what do I do? There's only one thing left, and that's overthrow the government. So,
That's the trouble with having done everything and been everywhere.
Right. Well, when you're down on your luck, the only thing left to do is overthrow the government. So, anyway, he started a rebellion of the Greek cities, Greek colonies in Persia against the king of Persia, because he thought, well, hey, we could try this, and so he then went to mainland Greece and said, hey, remember your colonies, they're in trouble, they need your help against the king of Persia. And the Spartans said, that's too far, we don't want to bother with it. The Athenians said, we'll send a few ships. And so the Athenian democracy, they all voted on it, and they sent a few ships over there. And initially they made trouble, and the rebels started to go somewhere, and they burned down Sardis, which was the regional capital, and King Darius got really mad, and he came and put down the rebellion, and so that was that. And the Athenians, were disappointed that it had been a failure, and they didn't want to remember it. Actually, I read that a playwright made a play that graphically depicted the fall of the failure of the rebellion. And the Athenians were so moved by this play that they decided to get mad because, it had brought them to tears and reminded them of the past. And so they fined him for making a play that, reminded them of their past failures.
That's an interesting concept, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, imagine if Hollywood put out a movie that reminded us of, a political disaster America had, and we all fined Hollywood because we were so, deeply moved by the movie. But anyway, that was an interesting little tidbit there. Anyway, so the Athenians kind of forgot about it. But, and there was a weird thing that happened with they almost tried to get into an alliance with Persia, but that I won't get into that detail because that's not super important, I don't think. Maybe it was to the king of Persia, but practically the Athenians forgot about it. But the king of Persia didn't. He had put down the rebels, and Darius decided that it would be a good idea to get revenge on the Greeks for helping in this rebellion, and that it was a good idea to expand the Persian Empire westward. Because, the Persian Empire at that point had grown so big that it was bumping against the some mountains in the north, and, down south it was bumping against a bunch of desert. And, well, here's Greece. It's divided into a bunch of little city-states that are always quarreling with each other, and it's, it looked like a good place to conquer for Persia. So they decided to try that. And at first, Darius sent over a bunch of ships and men to invade Athens. And so this was 490 BC when he did this. And all of these men came over to Athens to invade it. And the Athenians met them at a place near Athens called Marathon. And you have these hordes of barbarians and Persians that have landed and set up their camp, and you have a much comparatively smaller group of Athenians guarding this. And Athens tried to get help, but they only got help from one close neighbor, and they didn't get any other city-states in Greece to help them. But the thing about the Athenians about the Greeks, was their military formation of soldiers in a line. And these soldiers, they would stand next to each other, and I think their shields would overlap a little bit, and they'd make this wall of soldiers that was a few rows deep called a phalanx. And this wall of soldiers was really hard to break up. The barbarians, they were more scattered. It was more confused. And this wall of soldiers, this phalanx unit, was just hard to defeat. And it turned out that tactic and that setup overcame the numerical disparity, and the Athenians beat the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, which was a huge thing for Greece because, they hadn't had much experience fighting with the Persians, or the barbarians as they called them. And so this was giving them a lot of confidence. Hey, us and our phalanx, we can overcome, great hordes of Persian soldiers. So King Darius was mad that this failed and wanted to go back and try again. But he died, and Xerxes ended up on the throne, Xerxes the First. Mm-hmm. And this might have been the one that is in the Book of Esther. Mm-hmm. People aren't sure which, the Book of Esther says, Artaxerxes the king, right? And people aren't sure which one that is. But some have said that this Xerxes was the guy married to Esther. And the way Xerxes is portrayed by the Greek historians is interesting. He's portrayed as this really megalomaniacal type of guy. He's the guy that whipped the sea when it knocked his bridge down. I don't know if you remember that story.
Oh, yes. I think my children told me about that. They had a history book that.
Yeah. Well,
that.
and that probably isn't true. It's kind of a legend, but basically it was to show that Xerxes was a real pride buster. And anyway, when Xerxes tried to assemble the biggest invasion force ever, and he saw all his vast army, and I think Herodotus says he wept because it was just so moved by how great he was. And anyway, so that's the character that the Greeks thought of Xerxes. As this really egotistical guy, and so but he comes with an invasion force, and Herodotus tells us it was so big that they would drink up whole streams and drink them dry. And I don't. That might have been an exaggeration, and that when Xerxes came to one town on his way to Greece, the townspeople would give thanks to their idols that the Persians only asked for dinner, because if they had asked for breakfast, the town would have been totally ruined. And so, anyway, the point there is that Xerxes had a really big invasion force coming to get Greece. And the Greeks decided, we better do something about this. So Sparta and Athens and a few other city-states, not all, but a few other city-states got together and said, let's forget about our problems and let's just join together to, jointly defend all of Greece against the barbarians, even though we're separate political entities. We're joined together in an alliance, right? Maybe you'd think of it, trying to be a little bit like the Allies in World War II, where we're all in an alliance. And then, of course, not all the city-states in Greece joined them. And Sparta was the one that led that alliance. And the Spartans, they were kind of big. They were reputed for their skill as soldiers. Mm-hmm. But the Athenians, meanwhile, had built up a strong navy. And so the Athenians had had about half the ships in the navy. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to lead the navy. They said, Sparta, you can lead the army, and Athens will lead the navy. But some other city-states said, no, we'll die sooner than let Athens lead the navy. Sparta has to lead it both. So they decided to let Sparta lead both. And at this point in Athens, there's a really influential speaker named Themistocles. Themistocles has always been ambitious ever since he was a boy. It said that he would lay awake at night, and because after the Athenians won the Battle of Marathon, which I told you about, the general who won that was very famous and got an award and everything. And Themistocles was a younger man, but he was really jealous of that. He wanted fame and power and prestige, and that motivated him in politics. And anyway, he got to be a very influential politician in Athens, and managed to get his political opponent ostracized in that ostracism I was telling you about. So anyway, Themistocles was running things, and he was kind of the guy that speaks for Athens, mm-hmm. and can convince the Athenian assembly to do things. So the Spartans and the Athenians and the Sparta's allies all joined together to resist the Persians, and they had a famous battle at Thermopylae, which you might have heard of that, King Leonidas and his 300, where they, so the Battle of Thermopylae is kind of famous. King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 Spartans stood there in a pass and single-handedly held off the Persian army for 3 days, until the Persian army found a way. A traitor showed them a path around mm-hmm. the pass, by a goat path or something like that, and they killed all but 2 of those 300 Spartans, who died to a man defending Greece. So that made a big impression on the Greeks, and it was remembered and kind of famous in classical history. But anyway, after the Battle of Thermopylae, King Xerxes and the Persians were going to move on Athens next. And some Athenians wanted to stay and guard the city, but Themistocles persuaded most of them to abandon Athens. So he said, let's just abandon the city, and the fighting men, you get on ships, and our families will send, the ones who can't fight, we'll send them to other cities nearby Athens. And so they left Athens. They abandoned the place. A few Athenians stayed, but couldn't defend the city. And the Persians came through Athens and sacked the city. But most of the Athenians were gone, and they were on board their ships. And so at that point, all of Sparta and all their allies, the Greek alliance, they were scared, because this mighty host of Persians had beaten them at Thermopylae, killed Leonidas despite his heroic stance, and they had also sacked Athens. So all of a sudden, they're moving down toward the bottom of Greece. And so the Greeks and Greek cities up north had already gone over to the Persian side because they couldn't defend themselves. So most of the people who were with the fleet wanted to go home, because the fleet, the allied fleet, was up near the vicinity of Athens. And they wanted to go, most of them wanted to go back, each one to their own city, and guard that. Mm-hmm. Now, Themistocles knew that if the allies broke up and didn't put on a united stance, that it would be defeat. Because everyone would go home to their own little city, their own little town, and then Xerxes would come through and pick them off one by one. So he knew that strength lay in unity. And he also wanted the allied fleet, which had fewer ships than the Persian fleet, to fight in a channel. And if you have an island here and a mainland here and a channel, let's say I have a channel that's 100 ships wide. I have 100 ships. Now my enemy may have 1,000 ships. Or let's say I have 100 ships spanning the channel and my enemy has 200 ships. They can only engage 100 ships at a time, because the width of the channel doesn't allow them to surround my fleet. So it's wise, from a tactical perspective, to fight with nature to surround you. And then your enemy can only face you one at a time. That's why if you hold a pass, you can hold it with fewer men, because you can just sit up there and shoot the enemy, and it's going to be hard for them to get through the pass. But so Themistocles was smart, tactically. So he told the Greeks, no, don't go home. Don't fight out in open sea. Fight here near this island called Salamis, next to Athens, and guard this channel. Okay, because if you fight in the channel, it's good. And the Persian, the Sparta and their allies, the Peloponnesians. The Peloponnesians were Sparta's allies. They said, no, we just want to go home. And so Themistocles was trying to think, what on earth can I do to convince these guys to stay in Athens, to stay here? And so he threatened them. He said, you know what? If you guys leave us and go home, we're going to take all of our ships and we're going to go found Athens in Italy. Because in his mind, the city was portable. The city was the people, not the place. So you could just move the city. And he said, well, then half your fleet will go. We'll just move to Italy if you don't want to get us together. And so the allies grumbled and said, okay, we'll do this. But then they got really nervous and they just didn't want to stay. And so Themistocles thought of a strategy. So he sent one of his slaves to the king of Persia and told the king of Persia, the message he sent was, I'm Themistocles, the leader of the Athenians, and I'm on your side. The Greek fleet here by Salamis, they're planning to sail away, so you better move in and trap them in this channel soon. Now that was playing a little bit of a dicey game, because that's telling, you're giving the enemy inside intelligence, and you're hoping that he can trap you, and you're all gambling it on basically that if you get trapped in this channel, you're going to be able to win because of those tactics I told you. So Themistocles was doing a kind of a dangerous thing. Yeah. But he knew his business, and so the King Xerxes was pleased, and he was like, okay, this is great. Thanks for that, and I've got an insider force in there. So he ordered his fleet to surround them, and so the fleet, they couldn't surround the Greek fleet. They could only block the channel. So he ordered them to block the channel and cut off the escape route from Salamis on all sides, so that the Greek fleet couldn't sail home. They had to stay and fight this battle, the Battle of Salamis. And King Xerxes had a golden throne there watching the battle. And anyway, so the Greeks woke up the next morning and they couldn't sail home, so they had to fight the battle. And the battle was a success for the Greeks. Themistocles was right, and when the king of Persia saw his fleet routed, he took half of his army and went home. And, the war dragged on for a couple more years, but this Battle of Salamis was an important turning point. And after that, the enemy, they defeated the last of the Persians, and, and then the Persians didn't bother them anymore. That was the end of that invasion. But that was always interesting to me, how Themistocles was, could play, such an interesting game, and was so imaginative too, in terms of, I'm going to give intelligence to the enemy because I'm going to kind of force the enemy or tempt the enemy to make a move I want them to make so that we can win this battle. And it was, this guy's strategy mind was pretty smart.
Well, now you were telling me, besides all the drama in the military, and mostly I've noticed it's about the military in Athens, that they had dramas and plays.
Right.
And you were telling me some of them were absolutely nonsensical.
Oh, yeah. Well, in what I've read up is mostly because the military stories, those are the ones that make history, right?
Right.
Most of the story
written by the victors.
Yeah, most of the military stories that most of the history we remember is when something big or bad happened, right? We don't remember the history of ordinary life, and that is a little bit more boring, because to me it's more interesting when you have a story about some guy who did something crazy or smart. But the Greeks, they did have plays, and I read that Solon, which you remember from the first part, didn't like them, because he said, if a guy's gonna play act lying and stealing and cheating up on stage, what's that going to do for society?
Yes.
And,
good point.
Yeah, but they had plays, and I don't know too much about them. I've seen a few. Some were based on the politics of the time, kind of being caricatured, and that's an important source of historical information, because we can, from this play, kind of guess what was going on in history at the time, politically. But as far as these plays go, but there are they were quite elaborate, and the Greeks were very good with rhetoric and things like that, and making elaborate dramas, and we kind of think of Shakespeare in our own time, and what a playmaster he was. But there were others like Aristophanes, and I believe it was Aristophanes. I don't remember some of those other names of the playwrights, but they could do that. What I was telling you about was something that was much later on, so
history,
it would be a different introduction there.
Well, you can go ahead and skip up to that era if you want to.
Okay, well, so let's just fast track Greek history real quick. So, after they defeat the Persians, there's a lot of internal wars, and some of them are very fascinating. Like the Peloponnesian War is, when I read a book about that, I couldn't put it down. It's just such a fascinating story, and how things turn and do unexpected things. No movie writer could invent the way reality works, and how unexpected it is and surprising it is. And it's the Peloponnesian War is a great drama. But hundreds of years later, Alexander the Great came on the scene in the 300s BC. I think 333 is an important date when he did something. It's kind of one you can revolve him around. He was a little bit before and a little bit after, but he took over Greece, and he took over the Persian Empire. Actually, his father, Philip of Macedon, took over Greece. He retook over Greece, and then he took over the Persian Empire.
Was he the one that sent an army to what's now known as Germany, and they didn't come back?
No, this is before the Roman Empire. Okay,
Before the Roman Empire.
So Alexander the Great, he does his empire. It takes over the eastern area. It takes over what was once the Persian Empire, which included Palestine. And if you remember, the Bible takes us to the time of Nehemiah, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's about 400 years of silence before you have the birth of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Now, in between that time, a lot happens. This is 400 years of history. I mean, in 400 years, we went from the Pilgrims to today, approximately. Mm-hmm. So, that's a big deal, right? And so 400 years of history, a lot changed, and Alexander's empire fell very quickly after he died. This gets into Daniel and his prophecies about the king of the north and the king of the south and stuff like that. And then you have the Roman Empire that takes over. And so when you open the New Testament, it's the Roman Empire that is what you read about. But the Romans, they conquered Greece as well. But that Greek culture permeated the Roman Empire. And so you have a lot of Greek culture in the Roman Empire and in the day and in the times of Christ and of the early church, which we're talking about obviously after AD 33 or thereabouts is when Christ dies and when we have the church. And so this, even though it's 500 years after classical Greece and all those famous plays and famous statesmen and famous Hippocrates, right, and medicine. You may have heard of him. He's back in that time that I was telling you about with the Persian War and the classical. And after the Persian War, it was kind of a golden age of Greece, and so all these famous Greeks, their culture and permeates civilization for many years. I mean, we still have elements of Greek culture that have come all the way to us today. And, all of this, so Greek culture, it permeates Western civilization, it permeates the Roman Empire, and it's the cultural context of the New Testament Christianity. Now, if you notice, so you have the books of the Bible, you have the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then you have the letters of Paul and Peter and the other letters of the New Testament, right? Later on, there's this, and we're jumping into religious history, early Christian religious history. You have a group called the Gnostics, and I'm not going to get too much up on them because I haven't researched them in a huge amount of detail. But, the Gnostics, they wrote these things called the Gnostic Gospels.
And Gnostic means mysterious knowledge.
Yeah, it's got to do with that very much. Yes, it's the idea of, you come you come to us, and we've kind of got a sort of a guru type figure who's got these mysterious knowledge, and he's going to, tell you a lot of words and babble on and about, this, basically all these heretical beliefs about Jesus and God and things like that. And so it was kind of a blend of Christianity and Christian ideas and Eastern culture and, with some of the Greco-Roman culture of the day. So it's very much in the culture of the times rather than in the culture that Jesus established and that of the true church. And so you have the Gnostics, and they wrote Gnostic Gospels. Like there's the Gnostic Gospel of John. Now, I haven't read the whole thing, and I haven't read most of the Gnostic Gospels, but I know a little bit about them. They liked to talk about fantastical. They like to add a lot of, fantastical things. They liked a lot of sensationalism and drama and, really miracle heavy. We think the Gospels have a lot of miracles in them, but, not compared to some of these Gnostic Gospels that, really turn that up. They have Jesus turning all his little friends into frogs and, just it's kind of wild stuff. But I recently read just a little bit of a Gnostic Gospel, and one thing that struck me is it was going on and on and on with this long dialogue that reminded me very much of, well, it actually reminded me, because it was an English translation, a little bit of Shakespeare and some of the playwrights, where you have this character who gets in there and he just talks and talks and talks. And we think the Bible has long speeches, right? Where, Jesus talking to his disciples in the book of the real Gospel of John, goes on and on for several chapters. But, these Gnostic Gospels, each person, when they have their turn to speak, they just blab on and on and on and say things with many words. I was talking a lot today on this interview, but they were good talkers, and John, the Apostle John, comes and he makes this long speech that sounds very much like it's coming out of a Greek tragedy or something of those.
And people would actually sit and listen to it.
Although this is special wisdom, so you've got to get what you pay for, right? You come to get this special wisdom, there better be a lot of it, And it also reminds me a little bit of, other things where, someone's going on and on. And there can be two reasons. One of them is like me, I'm just not good at brief communication, so I talk a lot to try to say a few little things. But that's just because I need to improve my communication skills. But these ones, I think there's another reason you talk on and on and on, and that is when you need filler. Mm-hmm. When you don't have a lot to say. Like today I was going to try to tell you, hundreds of years of Greek history packed into an hour. But these people take a moment and drag it out for, an hour of talking because they need filler content. And also if you don't have, anything, it also helps mesmerize people to talk and talk and talk at them, and it also would impress people of the day to have a dialogue that sounds like a play that they might have gone to in the theater. And you come to church, and we've kind of got this version of the Bible that's like a play where we've added all this nonsense into their ideas, and it very much, I think there was a lot of Greek philosophy and Eastern mysticism mixed in with what I heard, kind of that, and it was very silly, and it helps to compare the Bible with these Gnostic Gospels because you realize the Bible is very straightforward when it speaks. It God cuts to the point, and He doesn't give us actually a lot of detail. He gives us just what's important, and every word is meaningful. Versus some of these Gnostic Gospels have a lot of filler. Mm-hmm. But that was that. It's kind of unrelated to the Persian War and all that Greek history, but it is.
So when they put
Greek
on a play, it was just absolutely silly. They'd have their wife crying and their kids crying, and
I don't know. I haven't done too much research on the early Greek plays, but I suppose that some of those would, like Shakespeare, would be classics, right? Mm-hmm. But these Gnostic Gospels, you can tell it was really just sort of cheap, just kind of bad writing, just kind of stealing sort of that. It was kind of like the Hollywood of its day, right? You steal a Hollywood movie script and you put the Apostle John in it, saying some of those type of things. It would have been the equivalent of doing that today. Was that idea? So, and it was, I think what happened is this guy comes and makes this long speech about how his wife's sick and about how it's unfair and about how, chance and fate and destiny are against him and how the world is unjust. And, then the Apostle John comes and, talks a lot. I forget exactly what he said, but it was very much in that same, what has Providence going to do for me, and this is a surprise, and all this kind of dramatic thing. And then this guy falls over and his wife gets up, and it's just kind of just this drama of this person dies and John raises them from the dead, and then that person dies and he raises him from the dead, and it's kind of more of a, like, I don't know, the Lone Ranger or Robin Hood, or one of those kind of episodes sort of reminds you of something more in that movie entertainment line than compared to what Jesus' forceful, meaning-filled words in the actual Gospel of John.
Right, and often if they said more than one sentence in the New Testament, the next sentence proved the first sentence. You wouldn't really need a lot of exploration to find out what the first one meant.
Yeah, so that's
okay,
that.
So one more point before we stop, and that is, these Athenians and Greeks and Romans, it's all about government, mostly what we talk about and read about. And so their endless pursuit for the perfect government for the ones that are governing and how it can never really bring peace to the human heart.
Yeah, as far as the government goes, you have this radical, for the times, experiment with democracy. And you learn that, it's very fascinating to read that if you're into government, because, you kind of learn from all the histories of the kings that it's not nice to be under tyranny. But you also learn that democracies can have failings. Like, there was some famous there was some times when the Athenian assembly would get a sort of a mob mentality, and all get super mad about one thing, do some rash action like execute their generals or something, and then the next day repent and go, oh, that was stupid. And so it could there were other things that you might point out, but on the whole, the impression I get of the Athenian democracy is not really a bad one, compared to a lot of the problems you have under the kings.
Mm-hmm.
You see there's these same political fundamentals that underlie all forms of government, no matter which one you have. But I don't think that Athenian democracy was a failed experiment or anything like that. I think it proved actually quite successful, because the critics of the day would look down on the commoners as like sort of in democracy is kind of a maybe a bad thing. And they thought that it was better to have some oligarchy or aristocracy. But Athens was successful. I mean, during the Peloponnesian War, before the Peloponnesian War, they actually built up an empire for themselves. They managed to hold on to it more or less for most of the Peloponnesian War. They managed to fight this 30-year-long war, and they lost in the end, but it was after a series of ups and downs. So their form of government was definitely just as successful as Sparta's or others, and they got their democracy back after that first loss of the Peloponnesian War. But I'd say that the Athenian democracy, it's something you should read up on, and there's some old classic books that you can find in public domain online. They used to be, it's my understanding that schools used to study the classics more. But 2 I would recommend, or 3 I would recommend for just beginning, for just like the not beginner material, but the famous historians: Herodotus, Thucydides, and Plutarch.
Okay.
Herodotus, now in all of these, they're not light reading, and some of them contain a lot of sort of inappropriate episodes, especially Plutarch and Herodotus. So you have to be careful. A lot of it can be very long-winded, confusing reading. But if you want to dig into that sort of stuff, I'd recommend those 3 as the kind of the leading historians. But Thucydides, if you had to pick one, I'd pick Thucydides, because he doesn't have so much of the just kind of bad taste and sort of, I get the sense, kind of sensual, sort of distasteful, scandalous episodes. These other people dig those up and put them in there. But Thucydides mostly is just about the politics. And also, Herodotus will tell some stories that might have been a little bit of kind of gets in some of the tall tales a little bit, where you kind of wonder, well, that seems like maybe an exaggeration. But Thucydides was an eyewitness of most of this. And, he can tell you. And then at the very end, his book actually ends before the end of the Peloponnesian War. It leaves you on a cliffhanger, and you have to go to Xenophon's for that. But I would recommend Thucydides. He focuses more on just the politics and the history, and fascinating.
Well, I'd like to thank you for spending your time here to talk about that. It's always interesting. And those of you who are homeschooling, or you have someone that might want to listen to this, this is for you, and it's also for your entertainment. So thanks for watching. I'll talk to you later. Bye.